Today we're going to get into lecture outline 2 in unit 1, and I'm going to pull up the lecture outline you should find in the unit 1 folder, and this is what you should be filling in today as you watch this video. And you can see the first portion talks about characteristics that living things have in common, and then metabolism and so on. So this is the lecture outline corresponding with chapter 2 in your textbook. So here is the PowerPoint, and we're going to start off just by talking about what this lecture entails. We're going to again describe the characteristics that living things share in common, describe unique characteristics of water, which is a very important molecule of life, describe distinguishing features of biological macromolecules, which means large molecules, compare and contrast the two main types of cells on Earth, and also give a basic summary of the theory of evolution by natural selection. So let's get started. So before we get going on those objectives, a quick lesson starter. So we're going to talk about water and obviously chemistry and cells, and a lot of our cells are made up of water. And it says here that 1 drop of water contains about 5 to 10 to the 20th power water molecules, which is quite a few water molecules, and that is 500 quintillion molecules. So just in 1 drop of water, there are tons and tons of water molecules, in other words. So obviously we're dealing with the molecular level here, right? Really small things. So what makes something alive? So, we're going to talk about things that characteristics of living things. So obviously I think we all agree that a lawnmower is not alive. So what characteristics of living things does a lawnmower lack? What does it not have that living things do have? Try to make a list. Pause the video and make a list of characteristics of living things that you think living things have, and then restart the video after that. So go ahead and pause the video and make a list of characteristics that living things have. Okay, so hopefully you pause the video and tried to make a list. Another thing I like to do in my face-to-face classes is have students basically give them a homework assignment asking them to write a response to the question, is fire alive? So whether or not they think fire is alive and why they think it might be alive or not alive. And then so we get into this discussion about what it doesn't mean to be living and what characteristics do living things have. So let's see if you came up with any of these characteristics. So the first characteristic that living things have is that they have a common set of biological molecules. So for example, sugars. Another name for sugars is carbohydrates. Living things have those. Lipids or fats. Living things have those. Proteins, and also nucleic acids like DNA, for example. So did that lawnmower have sugars? Was it made up of carbohydrates? No. Did it have DNA? No. So obviously the lawnmower doesn't have these biological molecules that other living things do have, and fire doesn't either. So fire obviously doesn't have sugars or anything like that. Composed of cells. So living things are composed of cells. They have a cell membrane, and obviously there's things inside of that cell and things outside of that cell. And so a lawnmower, if you would take maybe a piece of the paint off of it and look at it under a microscope, you would not see that paint being made up of cells. However, if you took a piece of an onion and put it under a microscope, you would see that that onion is made up of these little structures called cells. And so every living thing, we would say, has cells. Sometimes I get questions from students about viruses. Viruses, we'll talk about later in the semester, are not made up of cells. And so a lot of biologists say that viruses are not classified as living things because of that. Basically, they are nucleic acids, either DNA or RNA, surrounded by a protein capsule. So that's kind of an interesting bit of information. We'll talk about viruses later in the semester, but living things do have these structures called cells, and we'll talk about them later on in this lecture. Also, fire does not have cells, right? Fire does not grow, right? Basically, neither does a lawnmower. You're not going to buy a small lawnmower and have it grow into a larger lawnmower over time. But living things do grow. So you'd have a small. Think of a child, right? And the child over time is going to grow into an adult, and so we have growth of living things. So that's a characteristic. Movement. So living things will be able to move somehow. So even if you think of a plant does move. It moves very slowly, but it's going to grow, and it can move towards the sunlight, for example. And so anyway, living things, unlike unless a lawnmower was pushed, it wouldn't really move, right? I guess another example would be a rock, right? A rock doesn't really move, so that's another example of a non-living thing. And living things reproduction, so they pass on genetic information. DNA is the genetic information that's passed on. And so you're going to have living things make babies, basically, right? And sometimes that can happen asexually. So without sperm and eggs, you can have mitosis occur. We're going to talk about that later on. And but living things do, pass on their genetic info to the next generation. And metabolism. Living things have a metabolism. And a metabolism is defined as, let me go back here, as all of the chemical reactions occurring inside our bodies, or inside a living thing, right? I'll change that to inside a living thing. And there's lots of chemical reactions happening, either building larger molecules, breaking larger molecules into smaller molecules. So, a lawnmower is not going to have all of those chemical reactions occurring in it. So, again, a lawnmower isn't living either. So anyway, all the chemical reactions happening inside of an organism are called its metabolism. That's a characteristic of a living thing. And then homeostasis is basically defined, let me go back again, as maintaining a relatively stable internal environment. So living things maintain a relatively stable environment inside of them. So I'll give you an example. With us, we want to maintain a stable body temperature. We don't want to get much above or below 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, right? And so our body works to maintain this relatively stable internal environment, homeostasis of body temperature, that 98.6 degrees. And if we get too high, that's obviously a bad thing, right? If you get a high fever, your body sweats and does different things to try to bring it back down and to maintain that normal homeostatic body temperature level. Another example is glucose levels, sugar levels in our blood. You don't want really high sugar levels. You want, basically a certain normal homeostatic level. And so your body is going to work to maintain that normal level of blood sugar. And if you have a constant high blood sugar, then that's basically what diabetes is. And there's different types of diabetes, but when you have an abnormally high blood sugar level and you can't maintain that normal environment, then that results in diseases called diseases called diabetes. So those are all the characteristics of living things, and all living things have basically all of those characteristics. Okay, so we're going to turn our attention now to water. So water is made up of 3 atoms, basically, 3 elements, and they are hydrogen, actually 2 hydrogens, and 1 oxygen. So this picture is showing you a water molecule, and the red would be the oxygen, and the white would be the hydrogens. So I'm going to go ahead and label these. So this would be hydrogen here, and try to get black there. There we go. And this would be the oxygen, right? H2O. I think we all know H2O stands for water. So water has certain characteristics that make it pretty a very important molecule for our bodies and other living things too. So one thing that water does is that it's slightly negative where the oxygen is and slightly positive where the hydrogen is. So the oxygen is slightly negatively charged, and these hydrogens here are slightly positively charged. And that in your textbook it talks about the term polar, and that's really what that polar term means, is that this water molecule is a polar molecule in that it has partial positive and negative charges within it. So when you have a drop of water, remember there's 500 quintillion water molecules, so there's a lot of water molecules. So this water molecule would, and I'll just use a red here. Actually, I can't, can I? Let me turn back to black. This water molecule again has an oxygen, negatively partially charged, and 2 hydrogens, both positively slightly charged. And due to the laws of physics, basically opposites attract oppositely charged particles, or in this case portions of these water molecules attract each other. This partially positive hydrogen is attracted to this partially negative oxygen. That's actually called a hydrogen bond. And hydrogen bond is a pretty strong bond when we sum all hydrogen bonds together. So here'd be another water molecule. Again, we don't see the other hydrogen be to the far left here on the screen. But again, partially negative oxygen, partially positive hydrogen. Another one could be here. Again, partially positive hydrogens to the partially negative oxygens. Another one over here. Partially negative oxygens, partially positive hydrogens, and so on, right? And another one here. So you get lots of water molecules in just a drop of water even, and you get all these hydrogen bonds, they're called, forming between the adjacent water molecules. And because of that, there's a property of water called cohesiveness. There's a very strong cohesive nature of water because of all these hydrogen bonds. And so you think of cohesiveness as being stickiness. So very sticky molecules because of all those hydrogen bonds between all of them. And because of that strong cohesiveness, that sticky nature, you can get insects walking on water. And this would be for example, a water strider. And a lot of organisms can actually walk on water due to the strong cohesiveness of water, and all those hydrogen bonds occurring between all those adjacent water molecules result in that. So that's one characteristic that makes water unique, is the strong cohesive nature of it. Watch over here. So you can see these are all water molecules, and see the yellow lines kind of on either side of them represent a tube. And think of that tube is going up a tree. So trees grow vertical, right? Obviously this one fell over and there's a hole through it. It must have been a big redwood or something that people now drive through. But anyway, trees have basically tubes in them, and in those tubes that are made up of cells, water goes against gravity and up that tree. And so watch what happens to these water molecules here. They're traveling up that tube, and basically they do that because of the cohesiveness between those water molecules, the hydrogen bonds that are occurring between each one. So remember, there'd be a hydrogen bond here, there'd be a hydrogen bond here, one here, here, and so on, right? And so what happens basically in a tree, in a plant, is water is going to be evaporated out of the leaves up, near the top of the plant in the canopy of the tree. And as that water evaporates, it pulls on water down below. And so as it evaporates and leaves the tree, water from the ground and the roots will be pulled up because of the hydrogen bonding, the strong, sticky, cohesive nature of water. So sometimes students wonder, well, how does that water get to the top of the tree if you're watering the roots of the plant? And it has to do with the stickiness, the cohesiveness of water traveling up that plant as water evaporates out of the leaves. So obviously that's a very important characteristic of water, right? The strong cohesiveness. Another important characteristic is that it moderates temperature. And so here you can see a lake or an ocean. And if you've ever lived by a big body of water, like Lake Michigan, for example, then you might know, or if you watch a lot of the Weather Channel or something, you might see that close to the water, in the summer, it's going to be a little cooler on a very hot day than further away from the water. Or vice versa. In the winter, it might be a little warmer next to the water than further away from the water, where it's colder. So what water does is it, like it says, moderates temperature changes. Water absorbs a lot of energy, heat energy, before it changes its own temperature. So on a very hot sunny day in summer, Lake Michigan will absorb a lot of that heat from the sun, and basically because of that, and it takes a long time for the water body, Lake Michigan, to change its own temperature. The area right around, the land right around that water body, is going to stay a little cooler than further away from that water body. And so again, it takes a lot of energy for water to change its own temperature. And that's what moderating temperature is all about. I think you probably heard that your body is made up of a lot of water, and I think they estimate like 2/3 of your body weight is made up of water, somewhere around there, approximately. So you're made up of a lot of water, and your body temperature of 98.6 degrees doesn't change that quick because of the characteristic of water moderating temperature and having to absorb a lot of heat energy before it changes its own temperature. And sometimes students in the face-to-face courses will ask, well, why? How come it does that? Why does it take a lot of heat energy to change the temperature of water? It has to do really with the hydrogen bonding. And all those hydrogen bonds, you have to break all those hydrogen bonds in order for water to basically change its own temperature. And so it takes a lot of energy to break all those hydrogen bonds between all those adjacent water molecules. Okay, so there's 5 altogether, right? So strong cohesiveness, ability to moderate temperature. A third important characteristic of water is that it becomes less dense when it's a solid, when it's frozen. So when it goes from liquid, you can see on the right here, this little square, dotted square, represents the density of water. Let me do a laser pointer. When a certain amount of water in liquid form, and then the same amount of water on the left, but this time when it's frozen in a solid form. And what happens is, like I said, it's the same amount of water, but when water's frozen, it becomes less dense. The molecules basically spread out more, and that makes it less dense as a result. So this is pretty important because in the wintertime, frozen water, ice, floats, and it doesn't sink. And it floats because it's less dense than the liquid water beneath it. If frozen water was more dense, if ice was more dense, then it would sink to the bottom of the lake, the pond, even the ocean. And that would result in the whole water body basically freezing solid and killing basically everything in it. But thankfully that doesn't happen, right? Thankfully water becomes less dense when it's frozen, and it floats because of that, and it serves as an insulator basically to the liquid water below it. And so the whole water body doesn't freeze solid, just the top layer does, and it floats. So anyway, water is less dense when frozen, and again, it comes down to the hydrogen bonding and those bonds kind of spreading out more and becoming more uniform than when water is in a liquid form. So it comes down to the hydrogen bonds again. Alright, and the fourth characteristic is that water is a good solvent. So what is a solvent? A solvent is, let me grab my pen here. So solvent is really a substance that does the dissolving. So water is a substance that is very good at dissolving other substances. You know, think of salt water, right? Or sugar water. And you're putting these substances in water and they're dissolving. So water is really good at dissolving other substances. You know, think of Kool-Aid, right? You take that sugar substance of Kool-Aid or Crystal Light and you dump it in water and it dissolves in that water. Water is a very good solvent, very good at dissolving. And obviously that's important for our bodies because a lot of substances need to be dissolved in our bodies. And finally, water facilitates chemical reactions. So when we talk about chemistry and chemical reactions, we talk about things called reactants, and those are the substances that are going to react, and they'll react through a chemical reaction and form the products, and they often do that in water. the chemical reaction that forms the products oftentimes happens in water, right? So, excuse me, you could think of taking, for example, taking a sugar molecule and breaking it down into smaller sugars. That happens in our body often, and that chemical reaction would happen in water. So water really helps chemical reactions occur, basically. So those are the 5 pretty important, unique characteristics of water that are important for life. Okay, so now we're going to turn our attention to macromolecules. And macromolecule, what is it? You can see that in your lecture outline. What is a macromolecule? Basically, macro means large, and these are just large molecules. And we're going to talk about 4 of them. And you can see there's a spot in your lecture outline to write the names of the 4 and some distinguishing features of them. But again, macro means large. And see these are very large organic molecules made up of smaller units. So you can see this molecule that's showing you on the screen is glucose. And I'm trying to find my pointer. There it is. And glucose is made up of smaller subunits, carbon, hydrogens, oxygen, right? And there we have this macromolecule here, right? Large molecule. And you see the term organic? Organic basically means that the molecule has carbon. So you might have heard of a very hard course called organic chemistry. And if you take that course, or courses, oftentimes colleges, universities offer a couple different organic chemistry courses. Basically you're studying chemicals, molecules that are carbon based. And so you could study glucose, for example, because it has carbon in it if you take organic chemistry. So anyway, that's what organic means, is that it has carbon. So very large carbon-based molecules, these macromolecules. So there's 4 of them that our bodies are made up of. I mentioned them earlier. You can see there's 4 different pictures here that kind of represent all 4. This corn would represent sugars or carbohydrates. The seal would represent lipids. So that's another one of the 4. And we'll see the names as we go along here. This individual has obviously skin, we can see, hair, feathers in the hair. A lot of our bodies, our hair and organisms that have feathers, those are made up mainly of proteins. So proteins is another one. And the 4th, you can see this molecule here, which you probably guessed it looks like DNA. And so the 4th is nucleic acids. And DNA is an example of a nucleic acid. So all these are carbon-based large macromolecules. So, yep, there they are. And we're going to talk about each one. We'll start with the carbs, carbohydrates. So they have carbohydrates, you can see have carbon, again, organic. And there's oxygen and hydrogen also. And actually, all these molecules are going to have some oxygen and hydrogen too. But carbs have them in a certain ratio, but you can kind of see where the term carbohydrate comes from. And another name for them is sugars. So when you talk about sugars, you're talking about carbs, carbohydrates. So what are some distinguishing features? We get a lot of energy from carbs. So it's a major source of energy for our bodies, our cells. A lot of carbs build our cells. They're kind of a structural molecule that our cells need to build themselves, basically. Lots of examples. So here's 3. Glucose, which is basically, you get that simple sugar from a lot of different food items. Starch is a more complex sugar, larger. Potatoes, right? Rice, you get it from. And another one is cellulose. And cellulose comes from plants also. And cellulose is really, it's indigestible to us. So if you eat lettuce, you're eating a lot of cellulose, that big sugar. And we can't break it down to get energy from. Mainly it's fiber for us. And it helps with our digestive processes, but we actually don't get energy. Some organisms, like a lot of herbivores, deer, cattle, can get energy from cellulose. And we'll talk about why they can, but we can't later on. Really, it has to do with them having a stomach that has small microorganisms in it. And those organisms break down that big sugar, and then they can get energy from it. But we can't. We don't have microorganisms, and we only have one stomach with none of them in there. So carbs, right? Another one is lipids. Lipids, some distinguishing features is they do not dissolve, so they don't really interact with water that well. They don't dissolve in water, and they're really greasy to the touch. So hamburgers, you'll get a lot of fat coming out of the hamburger when you cook it, and that's greasy, right? So lipids are greasy, and so fat obviously is a type of lipid. So lipids also give us energy, and they store a lot of energy. Actually, they store twice as much energy as carbs do, as sugars do. So we get quite a bit of energy from lipids. It's a major component of cell membrane, so a plasma membrane. So if I drew just a circle here, let's say, oops, there we go. If I drew this circle, and this circle represents a red blood cell, well, the outline, the red outline I drew, would be the cell membrane, right? And it separates what's inside the cell, the cytoplasm, from the outside of the cell. And so lipids are a big part of that cell membrane. And we'll talk specifically about what kind of lipids. They're actually called phospholipids. I'll write that right here. We'll talk about them later on also. But I'll write phospholipids. That's the major kind of lipid that makes up those cell membranes of basically every cell on Earth. And insulation. So I think we know that fat, which is a type of lipid, basically can insulate bodies, right? And insulate our own bodies. So underneath your skin, you have lipids to help insulate your bodies. And remember that seal that I showed you, the picture? Obviously there's quite a few lipids there that help to insulate that seal from the cold water in which it inhabits. So like I said, fats are lipids. Steroids are a group of lipids. There's lots of different steroids: testosterone, estrogen. Those are hormone steroids. Cholesterol actually is classified as a steroid. So lots of steroids, and then, like I wrote up here, phospholipids, right? So phospholipids are another group of lipids. All right, so one more. Oh, I'm sorry, not one more. Two more macromolecules, and so protein is the third one we're going to talk about. And what is it? So people say that proteins are the building blocks of life. And why is that? Well, they make up a lot of our bodies and other organisms' bodies. So your skin has a lot of proteins in it. Your hair is basically proteins, right? Your nails, your bones. And so a lot of our bodies. So skin, feathers, right? Obviously we don't have feathers, but birds' horns are made up of proteins, bones, muscles, right? So again, the building blocks of life, right? Proteins. Lots of different proteins, and a group of them are called enzymes. Enzymes are proteins, and enzymes we're going to learn more about later on this semester. They help to speed up chemical reactions, and they're very important for life on Earth. And so we have a lot of these proteins called enzymes in our body, and we'll talk more about them. So proteins really are made up of smaller building blocks called amino acids. So there are approximately 20 amino acids in our bodies, and a couple examples: leucine, phenylalanine, arginine. Those are 3 of the 20. But you take these amino acids and you connect them together, you form bonds between them, and you get a protein, basically. So you can see these strings of necklaces here, and each little structure making up the necklace, each little bead, would be considered a protein in that analogy. And so you get a string of those amino acids forming a protein, and we'll talk more about proteins also this semester. Okay, one more. Nucleic acids. This is the final macromolecule. And like I said before, DNA is a nucleic acid. Another one is called RNA. And we're going to talk more about these when, especially when we get to genetics this semester. But these are, examples of nucleic acids, DNA and RNA. And actually, we're going to learn that DNA really is going to be used to make RNA, and then eventually the RNA will be used to make a protein, a string of amino acids. And we'll talk more about that later. Okay, so there are 2 types of cells in our body, and this picture is showing you these 2 types of cells. The bigger cell is called, you can see up here, a eukaryotic cell, and the smaller cell is called a prokaryotic cell. And there's a table in your lecture outline, and we're going to compare and contrast these 2 major types of cells. Our bodies are made up of eukaryotic cells, and we're going to talk about what makes them eukaryotic. And prokaryotic cells, examples would be bacteria. They are made up of cells called prokaryotic cells. E. coli, you might have heard of that bacteria before, and so those are prokaryotic. So we're going to compare them. So let's compare them in size. Obviously, we just saw that which one was bigger? The eukaryotic cell was a lot bigger than the prokaryotic cell. So in general, eukaryotic cells are larger. Which one's more complex? Well, the eukaryotic cell tends to be more complex than the simpler prokaryotic cell, meaning that there are many more structures usually inside of the eukaryotic cell, and we'll talk about some of those as we go on. And which one has DNA? Which one has genetic material inside of it? Well, that's kind of a trick question because both have DNA. All cells on Earth have DNA. But sometimes there's a membrane surrounding that DNA called a nucleus. And another distinguishing feature is that the eukaryotic cells have that DNA in what's called a nucleus. But prokaryotic cells do not have a nucleus. They have a region where the DNA is found, but they don't have a membrane around it called a nucleus. Both of them have DNA, but eukaryotes have a nucleus where it's found. Which one has membrane-bound organelles? So, can you think of a membrane-bound organelle? If not, we're going to talk about some. Think of organelles as being like the organs of a cell. Our organs are our heart, our liver. Well, cells kind of have organs too, and they're called organelles. One example would be a mitochondria. That would be a organelle that has a membrane around it. And eukaryotes have membrane-bound organelles. Prokaryotes do not have organelles that have membranes around them. So that's another distinguishing feature between the two. And finally, which one has a cell wall? Well, cell walls actually are, again, let me draw a typical cell. Don't think of a red blood cell because they don't have cell walls, but think of a cell. I just drew a red circle up here. That would signify the plasma membrane, the cell membrane. And then some cells also have an outer layer. I'm going to kind of color it here green. So there's another layer on the outside called the cell wall. So that'd be the cell wall, that green layer. And that cell wall is present in prokaryotes. Bacteria, for example, have that cell wall on the outside of their cells. But also some eukaryotes do too. So, for example, fungus, like mushrooms, are known as fungi, and their cells have a cell wall around them. Plant cells do too. Our cells do not. So, human cells do not have cell walls around them. So some do, some don't in eukaryotes, but basically all prokaryotes do. So here's a picture showing you two eukaryote cells. On the left, this would be a typical animal cell, like a cell in our body, maybe a skin cell or something. And over here on the right, this green one would be a plant cell. So plants and animals have eukaryotic cells. There's membrane-bound organelles like a mitochondria here in an animal cell, also over here in a plant cell. You can see something called the nucleus, right? Eukaryotes have that nucleus with the DNA inside of it, and so this is also a nucleus of this eukaryotic cell here, this plant cell. So anyway, two eukaryotic cells. This animal cell just has a plasma membrane, right? A cell membrane on the outside, no cell wall. This plant cell, it's pointing to the cell or plasma membrane here, kind of this white line signifies it. And then this green is the cell wall. And you can see it's pointing to it right here. This green is the outer cell wall. So again, some eukaryotes have it, and some don't. Plants do, and animal cells don't. Oh, actually, there's one more I would like you to know, and I'm not sure if I put this in your lecture outline. I probably will update your lecture outline and put it in if I didn't have it in there yet. But anyway, which one has a cell membrane, prokaryotes or eukaryotes? If you guessed both, again, a kind of another trick question because both do. Again, some don't have the cell wall outside of it, but all cells on Earth have a cell membrane, no matter if you're a bacteria, right, a prokaryote, or an animal, plant, some kind of eukaryote. You all have a cell membrane. Okay, so that basically summarizes the differences between prokaryotes and eukaryotes. So finally, we're going to talk a little bit about natural selection and the theory of evolution. We're going to talk more about this later on. But this, what you're seeing here, is called a phylogenetic tree, and it basically organizes these organisms based on their evolutionary relationships, how closely related they are. And you can look at their DNA, for example, and compare it, and the more similar their DNA is together, the more closely related they are on the evolutionary tree. So anyway, I'm going to point out a few things. You have prokaryotes, right? We just talked about those simpler cells, no nucleus, but they still have DNA, right? So bacteria, we talked about. Another kind is called archaea. That's another kind of prokaryotic organism. And then all the others here are eukaryotes. So they have a nucleus, they have other membrane-bound organelles. So brown algae, green algae, plants, those are all more closely related to one another based on this tree than they are to other eukaryotes like amoebas, fungi, and animals. So anyway, you're kind of looking at this evolutionary relationship here, and see at the base of what's called this tree. It's called a tree because it kind of goes up and it branches, right, like tree branches. And at the base of it, it says a common ancestor. So when we talk about the theory of evolution, basically it's one of the foundations of it is that all organisms on Earth are related to one another, and there's a common ancestor in which every organism descended from. And that's kind of what this tree is showing here. So people say it's the unifying theme of biology. There was an ecologist that said nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution, and we'll talk about why that is as we go along this semester. And really it accounts for the similarities and differences that we see among organisms, among living things on Earth. So, one thing I mentioned is that every cell on Earth, no matter if you're a bacteria, plant, animal, fungus, you all have DNA, the universal genetic code of life. And so that's a similarity that every cell on Earth has. And there's lots of other similarities as well, and we'll talk about some of those. But there's also differences too. I'll give another example. There are insects on Earth called beetles, and beetles have many similarities. They most of them have 3 pairs of walking legs. They have a hard outside exoskeleton, usually a couple pairs of wings. So there's characteristics they all share. But science has discovered 350,000 different species of beetle. So basically there's 350,000 different variations of a beetle on Earth. So there's a lot of differences also. But obviously similarities in that they're all beetles, but differences in that there's different variations of all those. So biologists use the theory of evolution to explain why we have these similarities and differences among organisms on Earth. And it's driven by what we call natural selection. I'm going to put a little link to a natural selection video. It's pretty short, maybe almost only a minute, in our Blackboard site for this week, and you can click on it and watch it. It's a pretty neat video on camouflage for, I think, some kind of insect. So anyway, you can click on that and watch it. But basically, we're going to talk about natural selection in here, and obviously deal more with it throughout the semester. So natural selection is basically the idea that nature selects for certain characteristics, and it selects for characteristics that help individuals survive and reproduce. Because in order to pass on your genes, your DNA, you need to reproduce. And certain genes will allow organisms that have those genes to reproduce more offspring than individuals with other genes, basically. And so that's kind of what it's all about. So if we look at, this tree mantid here, it really looks like the leaves in which it around which it lives on the forest floor. And so if that mantid looked like something else, maybe if it looked like I don't know, let's see, if it had the appearance, instead of like being bright blue or something like that, instead of being kind of the color and the shape of a leaf, then it might not be able to survive as well in that environment of the forest floor. It might stick out more to predators and be eaten. And because of that, that bright blue mantid might not be able to survive and therefore reproduce and pass on its bright blue genes to more individuals into the next generation. But if you're this mantid that looks like your environment, then you may be able to survive better than a bright blue mantid, and therefore reproduce more and pass on your genes, your DNA, that code for that leaf shape and leaf color. And so you might have your genes become more prevalent in future generations, and more individuals might have that leaf shape and color characteristic, basically. So that's what natural selection is all about, basically. Nature, the environment, selecting for traits that help individuals survive and reproduce better than other traits. And we'll talk more about it. Here's more examples of very cryptic or very camouflaged organisms. Here's a leaf mantid, right? Lives around different plants in Costa Rica. This is a flower mantid. It's hard to see it actually. Here's the head, the antennae coming out, the legs. It looks a lot like the flowers in which it lives in Malaysia. This is another mantid that looks like a leaf, again on the forest floor. Again, you can see the head and the antennae, thorax and the abdomen and the legs. Okay, so one last thing I'd like you to do is to think about how the long neck of a giraffe may have evolved. So the idea is that there were organisms based on the fossil record that were giraffe-like, that did not have real long necks like giraffes do today, present-day giraffes. And so how would giraffes evolve, get a long neck over time? And so if you can stop the video and try to think about that for a second, and then start the video again. So how would giraffe necks evolve? How would natural selection work, in other words, to make giraffe necks longer and longer? So sometimes there's the misconception that, like for example, think of having like you had a giraffe here. I'm going to do my best giraffe illustration. So think of a giraffe didn't have a very long neck. I know this is a terrible giraffe, but think of this giraffe here is having a kind of a shorter neck, right? Here's the eye, here's the mouth, and let's say that this giraffe was stretching its neck in its lifetime because the leaves were way up higher than it can normally reach, and throughout its life it kept stretching its neck, and over time its neck got longer in its lifetime. And so it got this longer, slightly longer neck over its lifetime as a result of that, right? And so, and after it got that longer neck, then it had babies. And because it acquired this longer neck over its lifetime, its offspring therefore had longer necks when it had babies. And so is that how it works? Is it acquired in the lifetime of an individual, a certain characteristic, and then that acquired characteristic is passed on to the babies? Well, actually that is not really exactly what's going on. It's really boils down to the DNA. So the DNA of an organism, of an individual, can change, and that DNA change has to be in the gametes, in the sperm or the eggs. And when that DNA is passed on to the offspring, when the sperm and the egg meet up, then that change in DNA could change basically the organism somehow. And we'll talk about again how DNA makes proteins, and when you change the DNA you can change the protein, and you can change the characteristics of an individual, basically. So it's all about DNA changing, and due to that change in DNA you get maybe a longer neck, so that DNA codes for a longer neck, and as a result those giraffes that had that change in DNA and happened to inherit that longer neck maybe got more energy because they could reach leaves higher up and therefore could make more babies and pass on that longer neck gene into the next generation. So we'll talk more about that again later on in the semester, but that's what natural selection is about. Nature actually selecting certain individuals due to them having certain genes that allow them to survive and make more babies, reproduce more than individuals that have different genes and different characteristics. Okay, so that is it for this lecture, and I will pick up with nutrients and membrane transport, lecture 3, after this.